Mark chapter 14. This is actually going to be kind of putting closure on our study of Isaiah 53, but I want to take our cue from Mark 14. As we've been talking about Isaiah 53, it is about that suffering servant who bore the sins of the people and who served as an atonement sacrifice and made salvation possible. Well, in the church, we associate with that most immediately on every first day of the week when we partake of the Lord's Supper and eat the bread, drink the fruit of the vine, and the table itself even says, "Do this in remembrance of me." And it goes back to Jesus himself instituting that supper. And so we know the seriousness of that weekly observance. And it's something that we're supposed to be aware of, and it's something we're to do purposefully and with our minds engaged. What do you think of, or what do you envision whenever you eat the Lord's Supper?
My mind always goes to Hebrews, when the Hebrew writer talks about how that he can relate, or we can relate to him because he went through what we went through.
Okay.
So I think he wasn't tempted, we're not tempted by all the time. And I also go to, I think it's Hebrews 9 or 10, it's talking about that without the shedding of blood, there is no need, or there is no forgiveness of sins.
Okay.
So I just think about, how Jesus was, the perfect sacrifice for our sins, and how that all the things that I go through and that I fall to sin and temptation, he went through it and didn't sin.
Okay.
But he understands the pain that I go through when I'm tempted or when I sin and I fall. And
All right. Very good.
I find comfort in that, as he knows.
So Carter's just bringing out the fact that, you meditate on the fact that Jesus identifies with us by becoming one of us, suffering temptation and yet being perfect through the temptations, and then his blood was shed for us and things like that. And those are the kinds of things that we should purposefully engage our minds with when we're partaking of the Lord's Supper. Does anybody else have any specifics that they find themselves thinking about? Yes, Bill.
I think about Jesus on the cross, going through the suffering, pain, and agony.
Okay.
To save us.
Yes, absolutely. It's when he says, "Do this in remembrance of me," he's just talked about his body and his blood that is given. And so we do think about the sacrifice itself, the actual atonement that took place on the cross, like Bill's talking about. Sometimes envision the cross in your mind with the body hanging on there and Jesus offering himself freely like that. And Jim?
I would think about, that's always, I like to turn to one of the, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, when the crucifixion took place.
Okay.
And then think about, how he was beaten and how he had to try to carry this cross,
Mm-hmm.
and then when they got him up there, they laid him down, his back being all, just, ripped.
Mm-hmm.
And they laid him on that cross. And,
Yeah.
They stretched him out.
Right. Yeah. Jim's bringing out, like here, primarily the physical trauma of a crucifixion and what that would entail, and reading through the gospel accounts of that, Jesus being beaten before he was actually led to the hill, and then what happened when he was there to be impaled on the cross and things. And, these are unpleasant, obviously, but we know the gospel is trying to tell us that that's something God did in our place to deliver us from it. And that's something that we praise God for as well. And so I think you can see that even the things that we've discussed here, and there are so many nuances you could think about, not just the physical, but the mental, the emotional trauma that he suffered, being accursed from God, by God and things. It all ties into our study of Isaiah 53 in some way, because it's such a central passage that makes a prediction of what God himself is doing in human history to lead up to that very moment, to bring us all hope and the opportunity to be saved once again. And so all of those things are good, and that's why it's, the New Testament warns us or encourages us several places, to do this in remembrance of Christ. To, have your mind and your heart and your worship directed toward the Lord at that time especially. Of course, anytime you're singing or worshiping, you do that, but that's a special time to remember the body and blood of Jesus and what that means. And so I want to look at the institution of the Lord's Supper and some phrases that Jesus uses here, and then look back in the Old Testament to maybe help fill in some, or maybe supply more thoughts for your observance of the Lord's Supper, and see some of the things that Jesus would have had in mind. In Mark 14, beginning in verse 22, Mark 14, beginning in verse 22, it says, "Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread. Now he blessed and broke it, and he gave it to them," that is his disciples, "and said, 'Take, this is my body.' Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them. And they all drank from it, and he said, 'This is my blood of the covenant, which is shed for many.'" So these phrases are pretty full of meaning and nuance, especially when you think about the background of the Old Testament. Verse 22 began by saying, "As they were eating." What were they eating? It was the Passover meal. So the whole historical context is the Passover. So Jesus chose the Passover as the time that he was going to present himself in Jerusalem at the height of the controversy, knowing that if he would show up there, he would be arrested by the law enforcement, by the authorities, because they wanted to get rid of him. And so this was all voluntary. He chose the day, he chose the time, and he chose this particular time because of how full in meaning it is, right? And then he was going to be, according to New Testament writers, the ultimate Passover sacrifice for us. Turn to Exodus 12, and if somebody doesn't mind reading verses 3 through 8, let me make sure those are right though. Exodus 12, and this is the institution of the Passover. Let's go verses 5 through 8. Yes, Carter?
5 through 8.
Yes, please.
"Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it."
Yeah, that's good. And so this is the institution of the Passover and giving instructions on what to do. You kill this sacrificial animal, a lamb, a sheep or a goat, and so, but it's young, it's a year old. So you take this lamb and you kill it, and then you do some specific things with the blood before you roast it and eat it. And that blood had the significance of being a sacrifice. And we know from the theology of all this, a substitute for them so that they don't have to suffer death. Because what was Passover? What was the point of it? God would pass over Israel when he sends the death angel to kill the people, the firstborn of the land. In fact, Carter, would you read verses 12 and 13?
"For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Blood shall be a sign for you and the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt."
See, I will see the blood and I will pass over you. So that's why you have the phrase Passover sacrifice or Passover lamb. You take the blood and you put it on your house, on the door posts, and then you go into the house and you obey this ritual, and God will see your obedience, your faith, and that will justify you in His sight in the sense of saying, okay, I'm not going to punish them with the death in their house. I will pass over their house. Well, that's again, Jesus chose this particular historical context and the meal that commemorated it. But what He's doing now is for us today. He's saying, do this in remembrance not of, back in Exodus 12 now, but of me, because He is the fulfillment of all of this. Now, we still remember the point of Exodus 12, but we remember it in view of what it tells us about Jesus. So that is when He says, this is my body. So they had the body of a lamb back then that they killed. But He's saying, now this bread, I'm going to change. You're not going to kill an animal now, but you are going to eat bread, which it mentioned the bread here, the loaf, that unleavened bread and bitter herbs that they ate along with it. But He takes the bread. Now this will be the memorial. And I want you to eat this bread in remembrance of me, because this will represent my body, not the body of a literal animal, but my body. Then He took the cup. And so there was a cup that was part of this meal. He, of course, gave it to them. They all drank from it, which, of course, shows the association of what Jesus is doing to them. It affects them. They're all part of it. They ate the bread and they drank the cup, which means that they are included in the blessings or in the grace that's going on here. And He says to them, this is my blood of the covenant. My blood of the covenant. Now we're introduced to some new concepts. Blood of the covenant. Does anybody think of an Old Testament passage that mentions the blood of the covenant? Somebody please read Exodus 24. And here we will read verses 4 through 8. Exodus 24, 4 through 8.
And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he arose early in the morning, built an altar at the foot of the mountain, with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words.
So see there in verse 8, behold, the blood of the covenant. This is the blood of the covenant. That's the exact phrase Jesus used. I know maybe your translation says this is my blood, or the blood of the new covenant. The word new is not in the original, even though it's included in the idea from the next verse. But Jesus just quoted this part. This is my blood of the covenant. Now, it is a new covenant, but he is hearkening back to this. And you see the concepts going on here that Moses is being the mediator between Israel and God and entering into this, what we call the Old Covenant. And he writes all the words of God in a book, and then he sprinkles the book with the blood, and he sprinkles the people with the blood, or on the altar and things like this, and sprinkles the people. But anyway, the whole thing is saying this is ratified by the sacrifice of these animals. And of course, a covenant involves the agreement between both parties, right? And so what did Israel say here? All that the Lord has said, we will do and be obedient. When you partake of the Lord's Supper, you're remembering your entrance into the new covenant and your commitment, your confession that Jesus is your Lord. And so, you're just reaffirming your commitment to God because of what Jesus did, because it's His blood now, and it's a new covenant now. The concept of new covenant is found in Jeremiah 31. It's found also in Ezekiel. But that was promised back then, and Jesus is hearkening back to those concepts in the institution of this Lord's Supper. This is my blood of the covenant. So we've seen now the context of Passover and what is entailed there. We've seen the concept of the institution of the covenant between God and his people. And then the last phrase we look at here is, which is poured out for many. My translation says shed, but many translations just render it poured out. It's enkeo or something like that. It'd be like if you just poured something out of a pitcher or container. You're pouring it out. But that idea is found where? In the Bible. You know, there are a lot of sacrifices that were poured out on the ground, but when it talks about my blood being poured out now, blood was sprinkled in Moses' institution of the covenant, but here's a different idea. It's actually the shedding of the blood of the sacrificial animal from the body of the animal. But Jesus is saying, now, I'm going to do that. My blood is going to be poured out for many. For many. And I would make the case here, as many Bible students do, that this is, like we've already alluded to Exodus 12 and Exodus 24, this is an allusion to Isaiah 53, where this specific truth is revealed. So if you go back to Isaiah 53, for example, you see this theme of one person, the suffering servant, suffering for the many. So one person taking on the sins of many people. Okay? And that's what Jesus is saying there. So you'll notice we read this, but verse 4, beginning in Isaiah 53 and verse 4, you will see the singular he and the plural we, or us, right? He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But it was for us that he was wounded, for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities, and the punishment for our peace was upon him. By his stripes we're healed. So you see the one suffering for the many. Now, the idea of poured out goes back to, we get back up to verse 10 here. So in Isaiah 53:10, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. You will make his soul an offering for sin. Verse 11, he shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify the many, because he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death. So this is where all of these concepts come together in this passage about the substitute, the sacrificial substitute who bore the sins of many. And this is what Jesus is talking about applying to himself in the institution of the Lord's Supper. This drink that you drink is representative of my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many, and Matthew's account adds for the remission of sins. Okay? And so that is the institution of the Lord's Supper. And then in verse 25, he says, I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine until the day I drink it with you new in the kingdom of God. This is looking forward to the establishment of the kingdom in earnest. Well, of course, we know in Acts 2 it did begin in its reality to be practiced that way. And we await the final consummation the Bible calls the everlasting kingdom, the heavenly kingdom. There's various ways that it talks about the future when Jesus returns to complete the transaction in full. But it's all in lieu of the fact that Jesus made all of it possible in his sacrifice. So are there some new concepts now that we can think about in the Lord's Supper? Maybe not new, but new ways of that he took. And therefore, we no longer have to take it. Are there any comments or questions along these lines? I have several features now of this suffering servant that Jesus identifies himself with out of Isaiah 53. Some of these we talked about just now, but some of these we have mentioned in the past few classes. There's this concept of, number one, that one person suffers for the sins of others. The concept that the one who suffers for the sins of others is himself sinless and righteous. The vicarious act, or that is the substitutionary act of the one, occurs one time for everyone, that has ramifications for all the future too. So again, it's a one-time sacrifice. It's not like that Passover sacrifice that took place every year, the Day of Atonement sacrifice that we've talked about, that has all of those implications as well, that the book of Hebrews capitalizes on. No, this is a one-time, because it was sufficient, because of the quality and the deity of the one who dies. It is sufficient now. Number 4, one intercedes for the sins of others of his own free will. So it was not something forced upon Christ. It was something he freely did of his own free will. And number 5, God intentionally brings about the vicarious suffering of this one for the sins of others. But this displays the unity of will between who's called the Lord here and the suffering servant, those two persons, the Father and Son that we know of them now in the New Testament, right? But they have a unity of will. It wasn't that, God forced Christ to go to the cross, or God somehow was, that the Father didn't have to suffer in unity with the Son. In other words, it was a terrible ordeal for all involved, Father, Son, Spirit, because they are all of one essence, though they are three separate persons. They all had their role, and I don't know if you're a father and you have to punish your son, spanking your son or punishing your son, it takes some of your heart out. Though you know it's the right thing to do. Now imagine your son offering himself for somebody else, and the extent to which he is doing it here on the cross, and the Father, because he loves you and me, saying, all right, I'm going to do this because I want to save you and me. And I'm going to pour out my wrath on my son. That would just be excruciating. And so the Godhead suffered like that. And, I assume that we would at first think the Son had to have suffered more, but the Father suffered in a different way. But that's what is being brought out here, at least by this student, saying the ramifications of this free will offering on behalf of the suffering servant in place of the sins of the people meant that both Yahweh and the suffering servant were in unity of will. And it was not pleasant. It was excruciating, because of how much they loved one another and how much they always pleased one another in their relationship. And now they have to put sin in between them because of you and me. But they do that because they love you and me that much. And that's the point. Any comments or questions? Am I losing you?
Not losing me, but it's never easy to understand. I mean,
Sure.
I think about it a lot, and it's never easy to understand because God is so omnipotent and knows everything. You don't think about how much I don't think about how much he suffered letting his son do that, have him,
Right.
don't think about it enough.
Well, that's kind of the purpose, I think, of the class, and the study of Isaiah 53 from this angle is to bring those things to our attention so that we can contemplate them. And it really was, the way you worded it was interesting, and I would say, the way you worded it was that the Father let his Son do that. Now, of course, he did let his Son make that decision freely, but the Father had to pour out his wrath
That's the part that's really.
on the Son, so that he wouldn't have to do it to you and me. Because he would have to, because he's just. He is a perfectly just God. And so that had to take place.
But if you had to choose some other kid instead of your kid, wouldn't you choose some other kid?
It would be-
I know that's not really even the way to think of it, because that's an earthly thing.
Yeah. But I mean, that's why it resonates with us, I think, because thinking of it as our own children makes it more intimate and visceral to think of having to do that to our own son. And I think that's what the Bible is trying to portray for us, to see that God was willing to do that so that we could live with him forever. In other words, it's worth it to God because of the eternal fellowship that he can have now with his creatures, with his people. But it doesn't mean it's easy, and it was so difficult, but it's still justified because of the redemption that came from it. Yes.
I was just thinking that might ease it just a little bit. When you punish your children, it hurts, but you know why you're doing it. And
Right.
So the end result
Yeah.
of why
Yeah.
might make it a little easier.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think of the word easier, make it easier. It makes it purposeful. It makes it worthwhile. It makes it reasonable, I guess. I don't know the other words. We're trying to come up with all kinds of words. But it is like that whole problem of evil that we're confronted with by the skeptics. Well, if God is this and this and this, why does evil exist? And our point is, okay, there's no way that you as a skeptic can show that there is no justified reason for God allowing suffering. You have to be able to make that case that there is no justifiable reason for God to allow the kind of suffering that happens before you can make that case. And we're saying we believe there is a justified reason because there is something coming that we'll look back and go, I understand why God allowed that, because of what it allows to take place, what it allows to happen forever. And that will be, well, it's Romans 8:18, isn't it? The sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glories that shall be revealed in us. So that's the concept. And I think that's what Kim's alluding to here. God, as excruciating and difficult as it was, he's doing this because of what his purposes are. And it's a great grace to think that we're included in that. Christians are included in that. We will be recipients of it. And not because we deserve it, because we don't deserve it, but we are recipients because God is a gracious God. He's a good God who wants our eternal well-being. So, but that's the concept of Isaiah 53, at least as it's kind of alluded to by Jesus in instituting the Lord's Supper and hearkening back to these principles and concepts of sacrifice, atonement, substitution, atonement, and all of this, so we can be recipients of it. So, appreciate that. Excellent comment. Steve, yes?
I'll just say that, that this whole thought process is such a motivating factor to be thankful
Absolutely.
to the very end.
Absolutely.
Even though all the little intimate
Mm-hmm.
details, because it's so deep
Mm-hmm.
to comprehend it. Think about what you just said, what a motivation.
Absolutely. It is to spur us on to love and good works, to see the love that God had for us. And, when you preach the gospel or teach somebody the gospel, like Steve said, do you really think that we understand all of these nuances? But we have the image of God in us to extent that we can resonate with the concepts, the broad concepts of justice, punishment, wrongdoing, the guilt that we feel in our own conscience, right? These are gifts from God because they help us to be able to sense in a real, visceral way the glories of the gospel that teaches us that God himself was made man so that he could suffer instead of us in our place to free us from condemnation and make us right with God again, even though we don't deserve it. It's, the whole thing is a grace toward us and a suffering on his part, but it is for the accomplishment of the purpose of being able to live forever. And so what does God say? Well, Jesus says, this is my blood of the covenant. So think about when Moses said, here's all the words of God, and all the people said what? We will do those things. We will be obedient to those things. Okay, you enter into this covenant. God's going to keep his side of it, you can be sure. Now you be faithful unto death, and you will receive the crown of life. And this was a concept we talked about last night in the class in the annex about the gospel truth that comforts us, knowing that even though we walk in the light, even while we're walking in the light and fellowship with God, he knows we're going to fall from time to time in sin. And so 1 John 1:7 says, when we're walking in the light, his blood continually cleanses us from sin. And all of those verbs are present tense, meaning we will sin in the light. But we don't have to be fearful of impending judgment, God waiting with a whip in hand, saying, okay, as soon as you mess up, that's not the gospel. The gospel is you can be faithful, you can be a faithful servant of God, and you still commit momentary acts of sin. We all struggle. That's a different concept than just giving up on Christianity and walking away and saying, I want to do my own thing from now on. And people can do that. But that brings us, the whole point I was trying to make here is, when you're teaching somebody the concept of the gospel, I think because we're created in God's image, we can understand that part of it, and that draws us to Christ. It says, man, he really loved me. He really wants to save me. He's on my side, so to speak, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And now we can come to him and live with him forever. But again, these Old Testament passages, this suffering servant of Isaiah 53 it's hard to overstate the importance of those themes that are in there. And they're not found in any other place. They're concentrated here in the apex of the servant songs of Isaiah 53, we call it, and the suffering servant. And the penal substitutionary atonement that he offers on our behalf. Sure, thank you guys, and we will pick up on a new subject next time. Now, next week is our singing, and then we will pick up after that. It's a new study. Thank you guys so much for your attention. We'll be dismissed.